Over the weekend, I shot an entire downhill competition using this Sirui anamorphic lens. And no, this is not a sponsored video. I don't want to show you this lens because I was going to sell it before doing this thing. But I wanted to give myself one little challenge before setting this up for sale. And the challenge was super simple. Go out with just this vlog camera, which is a Sony ZV-E10, and the Sirui 40mm 1.33 anamorphic lens, and come home with photos that look as cinematic as possible. My goal is to have photos that look like they belong in the movie, and I really hated it in the beginning of the day. But I also feel that I learned a lot during this challenge, and at the end of the day, I'm not only not selling my lens, but I'm also making this video talking about why we photographers should challenge ourselves more often. I totally knew when I started this challenge that the 40mm lens is gonna make things difficult, because 40mm is not wide enough to distort things and make you get right near the action for those amazing shots where the barrel distortion is exaggerating everything, but it's also not long enough to put you completely out of harm's way, and that meant that I had to be right next to the track and keep moving if I wanted to stay safe. And on top of that, I was a bit concerned about the autofocus speed of this lens, because the riders were coming down the track really fast in some sections, and I was really afraid that the anamorphic nature of the lens would make the sensor chuck up and not be able to properly autofocus, but I didn't have much of a problem there. And as the day went on, I actually started enjoying myself and feeling more natural than I would if I changed lenses during the day and swapped cameras every 5 minutes. I had just one lens and I had to make it work. So let's talk about the ways that I made it work, starting with framing and composition. You see, because I was shooting on an anamorphic lens, it meant that I had to shoot landscape for the entire day. And not just landscape, I had to work with a very wide aspect ratio. And I really believe that this helped me tell a better story, because there's so much around the rider. You can see where the composition took place, how difficult the terrain was, or even how the weather looked at the moment of capture. And honestly, I believe that the wider aspect ratio is in part to blame for the fact that most people who saw my final photos said that they look like they belong in a movie. And at this point, I'm pretty confident that our brains are just gonna default to, oh, it looks like a movie, whenever we see something with black bars on top of it, because we only saw movies having black bars and not much else, so we're gonna instinctively associate a photo with black bars with something that looks more cinematic. And I also believe that having such a wide aspect ratio preview on the back of your camera can help you frame your photos much better. At least for me, it did the trick. Because instinctively, when I was photographing the race, my brain tried to compose the way it saw in a movie. So the moment I was looking to a wider aspect ratio preview, I got the instinct to shoot like a movie, so my photos look more cinematic. But most importantly, in most of my shots, I try to leave some space in front of the rider, especially if I was photographing them from the side. So I wanted to create some space for the rider to go into, so it would feel like there is some movement in the frame, even though sometimes I was freezing the action. And the wider aspect ratio really helped me here. It created the space needed for the rider to go into, and also helped me with leading lines and a bit more space so I can tell a better story. And in the past, when I wasn't shooting anamorphic lenses, I even 3D printed screen covers for the back of my cameras so I can get a real-time preview and help me compose my photos better with a normal lens before cropping them down. And since I'm already speaking about black bars, I'm just very quickly going to remind you that on my website there is a set of presets that can help you take your RAW files from 16:9, which is the default size for social media, and apply black bars directly in Lightroom. But going back to my challenge, because I shot the entire thing using the Sirui 40mm lens on a crop sensor, it also meant that I was stuck with a single focal length to the entirety of the event. And here's where something happened to my brain. And to be honest, what happened here is something that I low-key expected, because in the past I shot for a long while with the 50mm lens, and in that period of time I was able to know if I have a good framing without even taking out the camera. But with this 40mm lens, it actually happened in less than a few hours, and by the end of the day I was able to know if I have a good framing without even powering on the camera, and because of that, it made the entire job much easier. After a while, the lens just disappears, and you're going to know instinctively if you have a good framing or if you should just keep moving and look for a better spot. And I think this is one of the biggest benefits of shooting with a single focal length for the entirety of the day. And if you haven't done this before, I strongly encourage you to pick a focal length and go out and take photos with it for, let's say, the next week. And when you're done with that experiment, come back into this video and let me know in the comments down below how it went out for you. Because for me, whenever I pick a focal length and stick with it for a longer period of time, I tend to end up getting much better shots. When it comes to lighting, I couldn't do much about it since I was photographing outdoor. I didn't have any lighting equipment with me, and even if I did, there would be no way to position it in the forest. So most of the day I tried to position myself on the shadow side of the subject. That means that your camera is on one side of the face and the light source or the brightest area in the frame is on the other side. This way we get a bit more depth in the photos, and I try to do that as much as possible. But since obviously that wasn't always an option, I also try to find frames where I get a nice gradient coming from a dark area towards light or the other way around. But of course this was all heavily enhanced in post-processing, so let's jump into Lightroom. And in here I want to highlight a few of the masks that I used throughout most of this series. And one of them is this linear gradient on the lower part of the photo that usually darkens the foreground. I'm losing some details in the bottom part of the image where usually there's mostly dirt. And to do that, I'm coming in the linear gradient that for this photo looks something like this. And I'm usually playing around with the curve in such a way that I create less contrast in the bottom part of the curve. I don't want to darken the entire area, so I'm not using the exposure slider. I'm just darkening the lower part of the curve so I get less contrast, and this way I'm losing both some saturation and some amount of details in the shadows. And when I say I'm losing details, I'm doing that on purpose. I'm eliminating distraction or at least toning them down. And you can see a similar thing in this image over here, where mask number 6 is doing the same exact thing, where I'm lowering the midpoint on the curves and lifting the blacks just a bit to darken this foreground area, which normally would have way too many details and would look distracting. But in this photo over here, I'm actually using one more mask on the bottom left of the photo, in which you can see I also use the exposure slider and a few others to darken up the foreground, so I can lose all the details in this lower left corner. This way you can focus on the riders and don't get distracted by all these rocks in the foreground. And another mask that I used a lot in most of these edits is the exact opposite, a large radial gradient that usually sits on a highlight or the upper part of the image where I have some bright highlights, and I'm extending it beyond the highlights so I can actually get the impression of a bit of bloom in the shot. And right here we have mask number 2, which is bringing up the midtones and the shadows so it simulates a bit of bloom right around his face, and is bringing up the exposure in that area of the photo as well, because you can see it was a bit dark to begin with. And I think that this photo is the best example of how it looks when you combine both of these masks. I have mask number 2 here that adds some light on the upper part of the image, and mask number 2 inverted, which is doing that darkening on the foreground. And you can see how much these two masks are reshaping the light in the photo, and I'm basically creating a gradient going from dark on the bottom to bright highlights on the upper middle part of the photo. And while this reshaping of light is something that I obviously done in post, I actually planned for it at the moment of shooting, so it's part of the challenge and it forced me to think in a more cinematic way. So I thought about ways to create these light gradients across my frames and to reduce distractions in such a wide frame. So Once again, the challenge forced me to think in a specific way, and I think I got much better shots because of it. But now, let's turn our attention to color grading and how I played with color to make my final photos look like they belong in a movie, because this was the plan all along. And color was another challenging aspect of the day. When I got home, I realized that I enjoyed some of the photos much more, and those photos were the one where the rider was wearing bright red, orange tones, or even a white outfit, and the one where the rider was wearing darker clothes or cool tones looked a lot more jarring. And while editing, I had to make both of the situations work, but let's start with this photo, which already has a ton of nice colors into it, and all I have to do is bring them out. And to do that, I'm gonna start by switching from Adobe Color to my linear camera profile, and now you can see that I actually have a lot more data in the photo than it looked like before, and I'm also going to boost the exposure pretty hard over here. And I'm gonna continue by going to my color response curves back, and I'm going to apply a Kodak Gold 200 push film emulation, which is creating 3 custom curves in the tone curve panel just in the color channels, and letting me edit my photos how I want with all the other settings available to me, while still giving me the nice Kodak colors in the final edit. But if you want to learn more about color response curves, you can check out this old video. I'm gonna link it somewhere over here, which is pretty old and cringe, but the information there is still super valid. Now I'm gonna very quickly do some light shaping in the photo like I showed you before. I'm using a linear gradient on the bottom right part of the photo, and in this mask I'm going to create a low contrast zone with a raised black point and generally darken the area a bit more so I get rid of the details. And also I'm going to create one more radial gradient on this brighter part of the forest behind the riders to create some contrast. And in this mask I'm going to do the exact opposite by raising the highlights while maintaining my midtones and shadows pretty much in place, just to generally brighten up that area and create some contrast throughout the entire photo. But from this one, I'm also going to remove this foreground object over here so it looks a bit more natural. Also notice that the jersey of this rider is a bit faded, so let's do one more local mask. I'm doing select object and I'm gonna select his jersey just to bring back some saturation into it, and I'm gonna do that with the local mask where I'm adding a bit of color temperature and also boosting the saturation quite a lot, while adding a bit more contrast as well. And basically I'm dealing with the small stuff first so it wouldn't distract me from the actual color grade, which is kinda already in place. I'm saying that because I already have that color response curve applied to this photo, so all I have to do now is create a mask that's covering the entire photo, and in here I'm gonna do my custom gamma curve, which is basically just bringing back some of the contrast and saturation into the image. But I don't want to add a ton of contrast to this photo, which is already super contrasty. So what I'm doing right now is a simple S curve, and I'm going to combine that with one more luminance range mask, in which I'm basically selecting the darker parts of the photo, something like this. And in this mask I'm going to massively boost the saturation, and I usually do that combined with the refine saturation decrease in my gamma curve, but this photo was kinda lacking saturation along the way, so I don't think that would be extra necessary here. And while I'm looking at it, it still feels a bit too warm, so I'm going to knock back the white balance with a few points and also add a bit more vibrance and saturation to the entire image, but not too much because the greens in the background have the potential to go nuclear and I want to avoid that as much as possible. Next up, I'm also going to tune up the hues in the photo because these yellow things over here look a bit too greenish for my taste, so I'm going to push them towards orange. I'm also going to increase the saturation in the orange and red channel to get everything to look a bit more saturated, and I'm also going to increase the shadow details slightly, just something like plus 40 is probably more than enough. And the photo is starting to look really nice, but overall it still feels a bit too warm. So one last thing that I'm going to do over here is add a bit of blue into my shadows while balancing this a bit to the right so it's not affecting the entire photo. And that's mostly it for color grading. I'm starting with the little things and then I'm relying on the linear camera profile, my color response curves for a nice startup and nice colors, especially that Kodak gold look that I really enjoy lately, and then I'm enhancing that with a custom gamma curve on top of the entire image, and saturation increased mostly in the shadow areas to get more color density in my film look. And that way I think it looks a bit more like a movie than if I would be to increase the saturation throughout the entire photo. And there's one more thing that ties everything together in these photos, and that's the grain. I do need some texture on top of the entire photo, and also my all-in-one grain presets are not only applying grain based on luminosity mask, but I'm also reducing the sharpness, clarity and texture in the shadow and midtones area, and that way we're starting to lose the details that don't matter that much into the shot, and also we're getting this fuzzy look that sometimes look like it's a bit foggy in the forest, and that texture I think it's adding quite a lot to the final look. And especially for the shots where I was shooting under the trees and there was obviously less light, I did a lot more grain using the all-in-one grain presets because I wanted to give the impression that I was shooting on film. And if you're shooting in low light situation on film, you'd usually use a film with higher ISO, and that one would have a ton more grain. So I'm just trying to make it make sense. And finally, let's talk about how grains were getting out of control in some of these shots, and although this one was not really the most offensive one, the way I dealt with really grain colors getting super saturated, especially in the brighter areas of the photo, was with a local mask based on luminosity. So I would go in right here, let's say I'm mostly trying to target the forest behind of the riders, so probably something like this would be good enough, and I'm going to intersect this mask with the radial gradient of the affected area, so it's probably something like this. From it, of course, I'm going to subtract the rider, so one more mask. I'm just doing an object selection, and in this mask what I'm doing is forcing the saturation down quite significantly, and you can see that the brighter parts of the forest don't really have that neon green glow anymore to them, and throughout this series of photos I use this trick quite a lot to prevent the grains for looking nuclear. But there's one more thing that I observed during this set of photos. The ones where the riders were wearing warm red, orange, maybe yellow clothes looked a lot more appealing to me because I have the tendency to sway the grains in the forest towards bluish looking tones. But where the riders were wearing bluish tones already, this doesn't look that well. So I tried to swing the grain of the forest in those photos more toward warmer tones, and I think that's the key to make those photos work as well. And that's it for my challenge. The fact that I shot an entire day using a single lens and put some creative limitations in place for myself truly pushed me to get much better final shots than I would expected at the beginning of the day. And for the editing, I think that one of the most important aspects to get these photos to look like they belong in a movie was to add that density and color saturation into the shadows while mixing it with the color response curves. This technique really enhanced the color density and the saturation throughout the entire series and made them feel a lot more lively. And finally, I really love how the grain mixed up with a bit of movement in some of the shots, and for those shots I was always using a variable ND filter. But that's about it for today. Thank you so much for following my story, and on your way out, don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button. Bye!